Hi, I'm John Knight Lundwall. Welcome to Myth and the Bible. We've talked about the concept the medium is the message, and the medium of communication is the thing that structures thought and civilization. This presentation, we're going into a deep dive into the oral world and how that shaped most of human history. Remember, like, subscribe, share, and I'll see you on the other side. I'll be using a PowerPoint today from one of my earlier class lectures, so let's begin. For almost all of biblical history, most people could not read or write. Now, this is a huge problem in biblical studies, in my view, because biblical studies is rooted in the presuppositions and prejudices of literacy. Of course, you're dealing with a written text. But for most of biblical history, so the Israelites all the way down to the writing of the Torah, less than 5% of the population could read or write, which means the population was working under different cognitive rules. And we have forgotten a lot of those rules. And they're very important to know when we start looking at some of the narratives in the Bible. Now, the features of Homo sapiens has been around for 200,000 years. We're not exactly sure when full sentient consciousness occurred, but most biologists say 100,000 years of human history, if not 200,000 years. Well, if I'm just using the 100,000 year date, writing is right here. This first black dot, 3200 BCE, thereabouts, is when writing is invented. That means for, 98,000 years, there's no writing, there's no conception of writing. But when writing is invented, literate consciousness does not appear. That actually takes about 3,000 years to go from oral consciousness that develops writing to fully literate consciousness. And certain things have to happen along the way in order for that transformation to take place. So the bottom line is we don't really get full literate consciousness till essentially the end of the first millennium BCE. And really it requires a reductive alphabet with few characters and vowel representations, as well as print culture, a way to easily manufacture text before you get an explosion of literacy. And this is what happens in the Renaissance. This is what happens in the scientific revolution. After the invention of the printing press is when we get primary print culture. This is only a couple centuries old. And so, ironically, we have totally forgotten that the ancient world did not think the way we think, did not process information the way we process it. It's completely different. It's very easy to say, well, they were just primitive or proto-rational or just religious and not scientific. This is the way it's coined, and this is actually sloppy thinking, and it's incongruent to the contours of history. So how do you transmit complex information without writing? And what is it that oral cultures want to transmit? Well, culture, values, their laws, the creeds, also their technologies, how you do stuff, how do you make stuff. This agriculture, animal husbandry, metallurgy, tool making, calendars. These are very complex things to do without an iPhone or a watch or a printed calendar, to do it all orally and manually. It requires actually an enormous amount of intellectual sophistication. And so to write off tens of thousands of years of oral peoples being primitives is stepping off on the wrong foot. Well, let's talk about some of the contours and frames of oral society. And to do that, I'm going to quote the first couple lines of the Greek creation story preserved to us by Hesiod. It's about 700 BCE. This is in his Theogony. And the first couple lines opens up and reads thus, quote, From the muses of Helicon, let us begin our singing. They dance on their soft feet round the violet dark spring and the altar of the mighty son of Kronos. So the creation story is introduced with these characters, muses of Helicon. Helicon is a mountain upon which there was a temple of the muses. More importantly, there are priestesses who man the temple, and they are the ones who represent the muses. And what are they doing when they tell the creation story? They are singing and dancing. And there it is. The creation story of the early Greeks was not a text. It was a song and dance performed in a ritual within a sacred temple space by the priestesses or the priests who performed it generally on special days of the year that represented the creation. There was a sacred space, a sacred time, and a sacred way in which to tell the creation story. Right? This all gets put into a text, and when it gets put into a text, the song, the dance, the ritual, the temple, and the sacred cosmology that underwrite the entire story is dropped. This is very important because our story in Genesis chapters 1 and 2 of the creation, originate in this exact same way. Originally, the creation of Genesis was a song, a dance, in a sacred space, a temple associated with a sacred time, the new year when the sun rose in a specific spot on the horizon, and when a star arose in the pre-dawn light before the sun. Well, this brings up a really good point. The early dramas that have survived, such as the Greek dramas, the writings of Euripides and Sophocles and Aeschylus, were performance pieces, but they descended from the temple cult. In fact, the word drama is Greek, and it means to act. Dramatic actors acting out a part in a play, right? But the word drama is cognate with another Greek word, dromenon, which also means to act. But dromenon means to act in a ritual. The Greek drama descended from the Greek dromenon, and the Greek dramatic plays descended from the temple cult. And in fact, in early Greek drama or Greek theater, it was actually a religious event. You were required to attend it if you belonged to the city-state. The early Greek dramas were dedicated to Dionysus, and there were religious odes and performances you had to do to participate and to watch the Greek plays. So drama descends from dromenon. And while we're at it, poetry descends from dromenon. The word poema is Greek, and it means creation. It's the creation hymn. And in our previous slide, it is the muses of Helicon, the priestesses representing the muses at the temple at Mount Helicon, who sing and dance the creation story. Well, what they're doing is they're singing and dancing the poema, the ritual hymn that belongs to the ritual cycle in the culture. So drama and poetry descend from the oral cult, the dromenon of these ancient societies. Well, what that means is, as we look at ancient texts, scholars, in the late 19th century began realizing, actually, most ancient texts can't really be read just as texts as we read a text. They make more sense if you read them as if they're actually part of dramas. So we have an example such as the pyramid text. The pyramid texts have different speakers, and the different speakers are often identified, and this also occurs in the coffin text and the Book of the Dead, later renditions of the pyramid text. And scholars realized, well, actually the different speakers are different play actors. They're priests playing a role in the ritual drama where this priest says this line, the next priest says this line, and while the text makes it sound like, the god says this, and Osiris says this, and the deceased says this, what is actually being described is a ritual drama, a dromenon, that is occurring, that has a much wider context than what the text reveals. And now here is the point. Things like the pyramid texts are footnotes and subtexts to a grand ritual cycle that is being performed by the priests in the temples and in the tombs. And this grander context has been lost. All we have is now the footnotes, the text. The text was the footnote, the subtext to the ritual, right? And as a result, we really can't translate the pyramid texts as in understand them. Translation implies understanding, and I'm not an Egyptologist, but I don't know any Egyptologists that really understand what the pyramid texts are saying. We have mythological scenarios, cosmological scenarios, we get the subject matter, an ascent into heaven, going through the underworld, obtaining eternal life, but the texts themselves are bathed in mythological and cosmological epithets and symbols, and the only way to understand those is to be initiated within that cultural understanding that, quite frankly, only existed in the ancient world. When you read a text that is the footnote to a ritual, and the ritual is lost, you're never really going to understand what you're reading. Okay? Well, it's not just the pyramid text. The Rig Veda is the earliest writing in the culture of India. It's the earliest written scripture, middle of the second millennium BCE. And this, too, is written largely as a subtext to rituals that are taking place, dramas, songs, and dances, and that these ancient texts really aren't texts. They're the footnotes to a ritual cycle. We have this grand epic called the Epic of Gilgamesh. We'll be talking about this in a few presentations in the future. Our longest extant work is about the 8th century BCE. But fragments of the Epic of Gilgamesh go back to 2000 BCE. The oral tradition goes back 1,000 years before that, if not much earlier. And so, once again, as we read the Epic of Gilgamesh, we have to understand we're reading ritual dromenon that turns into drama, that turns into a literary text, that turns into what we call myth or legend or folklore. But this is really a mischaracterization of what it originally was. And this is our hint that narratives in the story that descend from this oral complex of myth, ritual, temple, cosmology, they're given to us as, written text in the Bible, but they have a completely different epistemological background. Well, Eric Havelock reminds us that oral constructs do not fossilize until they are written down, or when they have already ceased to be what they originally were. So by the time we get this mythological data, it has, in written form, it stopped being what it was. Indeed, he reminds us the original oral network included epic poetry, chanted choruses, ritualized performances, music, dance. Consequently, all have disappeared from the surviving texts that utilize them. In oral societies, there are limited vocabularies. There's only a couple thousand words in primary oral societies. In our literate English language, we have hundreds of thousands of words. In fact, we have whole vocabularies of technical jargon. There's its own vocabulary for law, for medicine, for commerce, for politics, right? So when you become literate, you start developing your own vocabulary, which describes the processes of your own vocation or way of life. And literate societies have massive vocabularies. Imagine living in a world where you only have a couple thousand words. How does that reshape your thinking? Let me give one example. There was a ethnologist in the early 1900s who went to a totally oral tribe in Siberia. There was one left. And he spent several summers there amongst them, living with them, studying them. One of the things he did is he brought some boards with some basic figures drawn on them, and he asked them to identify them. And so one drawing was of a circle, one drawing was of a square. Well, this oral society didn't have a word for circle and square. Those are abstract words. Oral societies don't have those. Their vocabulary is made up of exactly what you can see in nature or what you experience. What you see, what you experience, that's it. That's your vocabulary. So he pulls up a drawing of a circle and he says, what is this? And the people say, oh, that's a moon. That's a plate. That's a wheel. They had those things. They understood those things. None of them said that's a circle. Okay? Held up the square. What is this? That's a house. That's a door. That's a window. Right? So they identified the objects by things they could relate to what they actually saw. All right? So when your vocabulary is only a few thousand words long, how does that change the way you think? Because it certainly does. One of the biggest differences between oral and literate cultures is oral cultures are analogical thinkers. Literate cultures are analytical thinkers. We will get into this again in the next presentation. Analogical thinking is if two objects share some feature, they have the same color, they grow in the same period, or there's some familiar feature, aspect, or function of them, then they are related and even equated. Whereas in analytical thinking, we don't do that. I mean, two things can look like and be entirely different, and we classify them according to what we've observed as to what they are, not what they look like, right? So, oral cultures have horizontal memory. They encode their memories on everything they see. And what they see is what they want to remember. So they can only build a couple dozen layers of vertical memory, which actually is quite sophisticated in order to do that. Most literate people can't, we don't have more than 2 or 3 levels of vertical memory because we don't train our memories to remember things. Our writing keeps our memories for us. So look, if there's a mountain or a tree or a spring, a bird or an animal, they will associate those things through analogical thinking to the functions they represent in their culture, and that's what will convey what they want to remember, the things that surround them. Literate peoples have vertical memory. We have print cultures. We can stack our memories in books and levels, and this is how we create microchips, iPhones, and space rockets. Oral peoples can't make those things. They don't have vertical memory. In order to have vertical memory, you need full literacy, a print culture. So, there's that. Oral cultures are orthopraxic, that is, they're ritual-based. They have to perform their memories in order to remember them. Literate cultures are orthodoxic or text-based, rule-based, principle-based. Our law is the canon of written scripture or written law. It's not a series of rituals that we have to perform. Oral peoples create mythologies. Literate peoples create histories. One of the criticisms that secular people have with the Bible is they'll read something and they say, oh, that is myth. We recognize that in myth constructs of the surrounding pagan world. Therefore, it's not real. And so why do you believe this? Please know that in oral societies, myth represented the ultimate truth. So, if we see a mythological construct in the Bible, snap to attention, sit up straight, because you're about to be told what these scribes considered to be the ultimate truth. Myth is not something that you say, oh, that's not real. You're about to encounter the ultimate reality. That was the purpose of myth. We just don't think that way anymore. Turns out oral peoples are concerned with history. They do want to remember some people, and so they develop ancestor cults. They worship their dead as a way to remember their dead. Not everyone can be remembered, but some people do great things. And so they have rituals that they annually do in order to remember the dead. The ancestors are part of the tribe are part of the ancestors. When you die, you join the ancestors. It's one eternal family link in an ancestor cult. Almost all oral societies have these ancestor cults. Again, literate people we don't do that. In fact, a lot of literate cultures don't revere the ancestors, or for that matter, even their parents or grandparents. So again, historical biographies is what literate societies focus on. As a result, in oral societies, the community takes the precedent. You do everything for the development of the community. This is that whole city-state thing with Rome, right? Everything you do must serve the larger group. In literate societies, we have individual ethics. We have abstracted the individual out of the community and have developed such things as individual human rights. In oral societies, there's no individual human rights. There's what the community needs, and that's what you serve. And so this is a different moral framework. And very often when we read in the Bible certain stories that seem bizarre to us, it's because there is, in essence, a different moral framework that is being operated from than ours. Here's something we'll talk about in the next presentation. Oral societies are polytheistic or henotheistic. We'll talk about that. Literate societies can develop full, true monotheism. So there you have it. Again, there's a lot of talk by the religious saying, these pagan polytheistic systems weren't enlightened or weren't, this isn't true religion. This was the early Christian argument that is still very popular. Secular people say, well, it's just proto-rational. It's these religious nuts that had all these deities. Polytheism is a direct result of orality. If you and I were born in an oral world, we would be polytheists or monopolytheists or henotheists. We'll talk about that.